have been working to succeed in a field that has long been male-dominated. Many of our members can relate to each other as the only female student sitting in a calculus class, or the only woman on a job site dominated by male colleagues. Women have increased their numbers in many professions previously dominated by men, including law, business, medicine, and other STEM fields. However, currently less than 15% of engineers in the US are women, and that number has been stagnant since the early 2000s. So basically, since I graduated from college, there hasn't been a change. Today, we hope to give you a better understanding of the state of women in engineering. The content that will be discussed comes from SWE's own research, as well as important data collected from partners in our community. We hope to convey what's driving the gender gap in STEM and inspire you to help us achieve gender parity. To tell us more about the state of women in engineering, please welcome Peggy Lane, Assistant Provost for Faculty Development at Virginia Tech.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to start off with a few numbers. As Jessica mentioned, according to the National Science Foundation, women currently make up about 14.8% of employed engineers in the United States and 25.4% of employed computer and math scientists. Participation of women in engineering varies by discipline, with higher percentages of women in environmental, industrial, and biomedical engineering, and lower percentages of women in electrical and mechanical engineering. However, you'll find the largest numbers of women in civil, mechanical, and electrical engineering, because these are the largest engineering disciplines overall. This is the data from the American Society for Engineering Education, showing you the distribution of degrees by discipline. Women have been earning about 20% of undergraduate degrees in engineering since the turn of the century, and the proportion of women varies by discipline in the degree distribution also. The disciplines with the highest percentage of women tend to be the smaller disciplines overall. You can see here, electrical, mechanical, and computer engineering are still graduating less than 15% women. The salary gap in engineering is less than in the workforce as a whole. But in all engineering and computer occupations, the median earnings of women are still less than those of men. Overall, women full-time employees earn just under 80% of what men earn, while women scientists and engineers earn 83% of their male colleagues' salaries. The size of the gap also varies by discipline, with female mechanical engineers earning just 5% less than males, while the gap for aerospace engineers is closer to 16%. Retention is also a problem for women in engineering and technology. Fewer women than men who earn an engineering degree end up working in the field, and more women than men leave the profession over time. Increasing the participation of women and other underrepresented groups in engineering is crucial to solving today's problems. Researchers like Scott Page have shown that diverse perspectives result in more creative options, and diverse teams ultimately produce better solutions. Now I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Peter Makesons, Vice Provost for Academic Programs and Professor of Sociology at Cleveland State University. Dr. Makesons will share some notable research trends on women in engineering from recent years.
Thanks, Peggy. As you can see, I'm not a woman. And as you'll probably discover if you look at my vita, I'm not an engineer. So of course, Ann Perusek asked me 5 years ago to help, to collaborate with Peggy on writing SWE's annual literature review, which is how I come to be here. What I'll try to do is very quickly summarize for you some of the major themes that Peggy and I, and now Casey, who's joined the group, have been discovering over the last 5 years in the literature on what's actually accounting for the small numbers of engineers who are female. basically what we've found is that if we ask what the social scientific research on women in engineering tells us about the numbers of women in engineering, is that there really is no single answer to the question of why there are so few and why the progress has stalled in the way that was just mentioned. And if we review what we've read, what I think needs to happen is we need to look at each stage in the life course or in the professional life course of women as they progress through the engineering curriculum and then later on into the workforce to discover where the pressure points are, where the spots are, where the problems develop. So I'll try to do that here. First, there's a great deal of material in the literature talking about the effect of what happens prior to university in the K through 12 pipeline, focused on the question of why girls aren't attracted to engineering. One theme raises the question of whether or not the field continues to be stereotyped as male and therefore presents itself as unattractive to women. And there's a great deal of research indicating that that continues to be the case despite efforts to make engineering seem more welcoming to women. And there's similarly research showing that women who have female science teachers or who see female images are much more likely to see engineering as something that's attractive to them. Similarly, a lot of research has focused on the question of whether engineering presents itself in such a way as to appeal to women. Considerable numbers of critiques of the extent to which engineering education or what's presented to children in school focuses on cars and rockets. Issues which might not be as attractive to young women and maybe should be thinking about things like environmental issues or solving social problems, which at least appear to be of more interest to women. Historically, math was perceived as a big obstacle to women's attraction to engineering. It's a classic article by Sally Hacker, which some of you may have read from way back in the 70s and 80s, which talked about calculus as the obstacle. That argument has been weakened, obviously, as women's math achievement has caught up or even surpassed men's. So it's harder to argue that math remains the obstacle, at least if one talks about math achievement. But there's a certain amount of evidence that although women now outscore men in math by many measures, that they may not value math as much or in the same way as their male counterparts, which may affect career choices. Similarly, there is a very interesting piece of research we reviewed a couple of years ago, which found that women who are good at math are also good at other things, which I regret to say distinguished them from men who were good at math, according to this research. And so essentially the argument was that women had choices that men who were good at math did not, and so that might lead to some self-selection out of math-intensive fields. What's also quite clear is that whether or not the achievement gap has been closed, the belief that women are not as good as men at math persists, and it persists among women as well as among men, which has led to a lot of research on the effect of stereotype threat. What happens when women think about or are told that they're not as good at math as men? The evidence suggests that simply telling women that they're not as good at math actually causes them to underachieve. And so that may actually depress women's achievement levels or performance on tests that they may need to overcome in order to make their way through the pipeline. So another step in the process is what happens in college. In college, there's been a lot of emphasis on whether or not women find a welcoming environment, or do they encounter the college professor who tells them, "What are you doing here?" or asks them what they're doing here. There's also been a lot of attention to the question of whether the curriculum in the university is too male, the cars rocket ship example problem that I talked about earlier. And there's a great deal of emphasis on whether the way in which women's passage through college causes them to wonder about whether they will fit into the engineering culture that they'll find once they get out of the university. There's a very interesting article that will be reviewed in this year's literature review by Carol Sarin and a team of people out in California, looking at how women's experience in things like internships and teams teaches them different things than what men do. For example, the women in teams discover that they're expected to manage the team and to organize the work while the men do the work. And that this produces a very different kind of sense of what being an engineer might be like and may turn off some young women. So there's a lot of focus on whether the engineering curriculum itself needs to be interrogated to see whether it's actually communicating messages that discourage women. The pipeline metaphor has been referred to earlier. Are there leaks in the pipeline? At what points in the process do women leave? We know that the numbers of women in practice are smaller than the numbers of women who get degrees, so where do they go? Right? It used to be that the focus is on women leaving during college, but the research that we've reviewed over the past few years really makes that a problematic conclusion. It's not at all clear that that's where the leak is. Lots of people leave engineering college, men do too. And there's not really clear indications that more women leave engineering than leave other fields. If anything, it's the reverse. So that may not be the problem. There are, however, real questions about women graduates, whether or not they choose to enter engineering. There's clearly a leak at that point. The numbers of women who persist and continue on to graduate programs are lower. So there clearly are leaks in the pipeline as people move through college, but especially as they leave college and begin to enter the workforce. What happens in the workforce is a question that I think needs to be addressed as well, and we've complained for many years about the lack of systematic research on practicing women engineers outside the university setting, that it's a very under-researched area. Do a literature search for female doctors and you'll get a way longer list than you will get for female engineers. There's been a very vigorous debate over the last few years about whether there's hiring bias, particularly in academic science and engineering. Some of you are familiar with the work done at Cornell, which claims that there isn't. There's also a vigorous critique of that research by others, and this is a question that continues to be under debate. What's not under dispute is that work-family issues clearly are an obstacle to women's persistence in engineering. Whether or not there's bias, it's quite clear that women either find that they have difficulty finding family-friendly policies, or if they're there, taking advantage of them without actually causing harm to their careers. There's also a certain amount of evidence that women's contributions in the workplace are undervalued. There's a fairly long literature on invisible work, which documents the work that women do, or women often are the ones who do, which is not recognized by employers and is not even described as work, but which is actually essential to the functioning of many workplaces. Finally, a last theme. Am I on the right thing? Yes. The last theme that has really emerged in the literature, particularly recently, focuses on the whole issue of intersectionality, which I think Casey will talk about a bit more. But just to introduce that, there are clearly even fewer women of color than there are women in the engineering workforce relative to the numbers that would be there if they were truly adequately represented. And we're beginning to get a sense of why that may be. Women of color are particularly likely to start their educational careers in community colleges as opposed to in four-year institutions. And so the obstacles to moving from community college to four-year schools really need to be the focus of attention if one were to really seriously increase recruitment of women, from Latino and African American women to engineering. The most traditional source of young women for engineering careers, young women of color, was historically black colleges and universities. But enrollments in those universities are dropping. And so there's been a shrinking pool of women from whom engineering programs can recruit. And what we've also begun to discover is that the problems of recruiting Latino and African American women to engineering aren't simply the problems of recruiting women writ large, that there are characteristics specific to women of color, which is the focus, I think, of Casey's presentation. And so that's an issue that needs to be addressed. So that was a really, really quick guided tour of 5 years of research. with an advance notice about year 6. I'll stop at this point and introduce the next speaker, who's Casey Beddoes, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and is also part of the team that does SWE's Literature Review each year. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, please. So I'm going to review a little of what Peter said and then talk about some new research we're starting to see as well as we've done the literature review. So as Peter mentioned, there's some pretty common and established themes that we see in the literature year after year. And those are things like explicit biases and prejudices, the ways in which engineering is gendered male, math outcomes, like Peter mentioned, and again, studies that focus on this leaky pipeline metaphor. But last year, we also wanted to highlight a couple of new and emerging themes that we hope will continue to grow as the years go on. And those were studies around teamwork culture, both in engineering education and in the workplace, and also studies that are starting to recognize the importance of intersectionality. So those are the two I'm going to talk about a little today. Can I go to the next one? Thanks. So starting with teamwork. There's this growing body of research that's documenting the ways in which women run into barriers when they're working in teams, and other ways in which teamwork is gendered. So one of those ways is both implicit and explicit biases and sexism that women encounter when they're working in groups with mostly men. You often hear about women's contributions not being heard or not recognized. Often this comes up when a woman will say something and then later a man says something and then everybody hears it. Microaggressions and team roles are something that people are starting to look at. And so Peter mentioned this study we'll talk about in this year's literature review. There's a growing recognition that women are often put in these managerial or soft skill roles as opposed to the technical roles. And so we see this happening in the workplace and in engineering education settings. Of course, the problems then are that not everybody is learning those technical skills, which are still what's really valued. So in my own work, what I see too is engineering professors framing this as a good thing without recognizing why it's problematic. So there's a lot of focus on that it's really good now that women are taking on all these leadership roles in the teams without the recognition of what that kind of code word leadership actually means. The project topics themselves, like Peter mentioned, a lot of them being about cars, for example. So there's critiques of what kind of projects are actually getting done and how those might be gendered. And then also starting to talk about the way in which these team projects are evaluated and who gets credit for what. And part of that goes back to who's doing what, who's doing the technical work versus who's not. And so when we start to look at teamwork and when we have these questions about why women are leaving engineering or not even entering engineering careers in the first place, and how we can explain that, especially when we compare it to other professions, people are suggesting that teamwork really holds a big part of the explanation there that distinguishes it from other professions. And to the extent that we start focusing on things within engineering itself, within engineering culture, hopefully that can be a pretty important shift in the way a lot of this research gets done compared to, for example, focusing on individual women themselves. And so the second theme we wanted to highlight today that we hope will continue to grow is intersectional research on gender. And so intersectionality is this idea that gender can't be understood as separate from other facets of people's identities. And so some of those other facets would be things like race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. And so there's a growing recognition that almost all of the research we have just talks about, quote, women in engineering, but really within that group of women in engineering, people's experiences vary along these different lines, and that needs to be better understood and better accounted for in the research. And so the idea is that these forms of disadvantage aren't just additive, but they really intersect in complex ways, and it's important to understand those differences. So I'll conclude by highlighting a few directions that we see for promising research, including the two I've already talked about, intersectionality and more studies of teamwork. In addition to those, future work on stereotypes, and looking at where have they changed and where have they really not changed over the years. As Peter mentioned, more studies that focus on workplace studies. So much of this is in academic settings. So more studies of workplaces. What can be done to make engineering more appealing to women? What are the gendered structures of engineering education and workplaces that are impeding change? So again, focusing more on the context of engineering itself. As I mentioned, more studies that address the intersections of race and gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And some meta-analyses that look at how to make sense of conflicting claims that often come out in the research. We don't have a lot of those to make sense of why one study found this and why one study found something different. And again, continuing to advance research that looks at the importance of teamwork in engineering and how that can be playing a role in women's underrepresentation in engineering. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We'd like to tell you about research that's being conducted by the Association for Women in Science. So please welcome Dr. Heather Metcalf, who is Director of Research and Analysis at AWIS.
Thank you, Casey. As she said, I'm the Director for Research and Analysis for the Association for Women in Science. And I'd like to talk to you about the 4 core research areas that we've been working on at the association. Over the past 45 years of our existence, our research agenda has grown, and these are the core focus areas for us moving forward. So the first is diversity, inclusion, and broadening participation. A lot of our work in this space has an intersectional approach to it, so I'm glad that Casey mentioned the importance of intersectionality in the research moving forward. Another key area for us is looking at equitable workplace policies, practices, and cultures. So for AWIS as an organization, our key focus is on looking at systemic change and how experiences that women from a variety of backgrounds have in the STEM workplace, and how we can take a research policy and practice approach to making some systemic change. The next area of research that we focus in on is on leadership promotion and recognition. And the last is innovation and entrepreneurship. And I'll walk us through a couple of examples of the research projects that we're doing in each of these areas. So the first, on diversity, inclusion, and broadening participation, we have a report on broadening participation that we'll be launching in January. And some of the really interesting things that we're finding, because we're taking this intersectional approach that not many people tend to do, especially with large-scale national level data, is that, for example, greater than 68% of people who report a severe difficulty walking are outside of the workforce versus 14% of people with no difficulty walking. And we've been able to see some really interesting trends by discipline and when we look at gender. So these figures within engineering in particular, the 14% figure that we see here is actually much lower, and when we look at women and women of color in that, it's even lower than that. So it gives us a good sense of how disability, gender, and race all come together to impact workplace experiences. Another key finding that we're having is on LGBTQ plus women. Some research coming right out of the discipline of physics shows that women who identify as LGBTQ experience 3 times more harassment than their counterparts. We've also found that since 2003, Black women have earned 1% of PhDs in physics, engineering, math, and computer science, as well as geosciences. And one of our AWIS members was the only Black person in the United States to earn a PhD in astronomy when she graduated in 2011. So we can see some really interesting patterns when we start to cross some of these categories together and look at how they're tightly twisted and tell us the complex stories of people's experiences within STEM disciplines. Some of our work coming out of equitable workplace policies, practices, and cultures comes from our book on equitable solutions for retaining a robust workforce. We have in the back of the room some of our executive summaries from that book if you're interested in checking it out. This was a large-scale global study of working scientists that we did in conjunction with the Elsevier Foundation. We found that fewer than 3/5 of our respondents were satisfied with their work-life integration. However, the importance of work-life integration to individuals' workplace experiences was equal for those who were under the age of 40 when we split it out by gender. So both men and women were reporting that this was very important to them and something they were looking for in their workplaces when they're below the age of 40. 54% of our women who responded to the survey versus 28% of men reported that they were responsible for the core household tasks. Men were 16% more likely to report workplaces that were family friendly, and women were 10% more likely to report negative career consequences from trying to find a better work-life integration for themselves. We also asked about how frequently work demands conflicted with personal life demands, and regardless of gender, the vast majority of our respondents were saying that at least 2 to 3 times a week, their work-life situations were creating a lot of conflict for them. So this is another area I think that's really important in considering the policies that we're putting in place in our workplaces and how they might differentially impact the individuals that we have in those spaces. In our area of leadership, promotion, and recognition, we've been doing ongoing work looking at awards and recognition. So we partnered with 18 different STEM disciplinary societies as part of a National Science Foundation grant that we have done. To look at the distribution of awards by gender, but also by the type of award. And as was mentioned earlier, a lot of women are being recognized for gender stereotypical roles that are more communal, teaching and service oriented, but they're being under-recognized for their scholarly and research contributions. And what we found was that regardless of their representation in the nomination pool, women were half as likely to win research awards. When we consider the proportion in the nomination pool, men were actually 8 times more likely to win those awards than women were. So it's really important to look at these questions around bias and how those become embedded within the awards criteria and also the evaluation that is happening there. In our innovation and entrepreneurship space, we've been conducting a lot of research here, and we've been hosting national level summits that bring together researchers, folks from government, policymakers, investors, lots of folks across the sectors to really come to and put the great thoughts that they're having, experiences, their policy work, and research together to really understand the intersections of gender, STEM, and entrepreneurship and innovation. And in the back of the room, we also have a handout around a lot of the research findings in this space. Specifically to engineering, we have found that the degree fields that are most tightly connected to entrepreneurship, the 5 top, are all coming from engineering. So they're aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, fields like that. So it's really important to think about this impact of entrepreneurship or of participation in those fields related to entrepreneurship. These are also the fields that have the highest levels of industry funding and the lowest rates of women's participation. We found that women in STEM file fewer patents, are half as likely to start, own, or manage their own business. They're half as likely to be tapped by tech transfer officers for commercialization, and there's a lot of research that's showing the role of bias in that. They're also less likely to receive venture capital, so they receive less than 4% of venture capital, and less than 1% goes to women of color, and this is all despite controls for the financial health of the company. And they also receive less than 14% of small business industry research funding. The bulk of this research is showing a slew of bias and barriers in all of these different spaces, including in access to funding and key networks and sponsors, different training environment experiences, the reward structures and perceptions that women are having around commercialization, as well as promotion into leadership roles within companies. And this is just some contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us. We're doing a lot of work in this space, and I'm glad that I was able to be here and share it with you. Next, I'll pass this over to Beth Michaels, who's the president of Primer Michaels. She's going to share the results of two important research studies that SWE has been conducting over the past year. She consulted with SWE on the first gender-based culture study of its kind conducted in the STEM space in the United States. And the study reveals why women are leaving the technical workforce for reasons that we might not have thought previously.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I am trying to adjust this mic. Okay. I am really thrilled to be with you today to share the results of the first national research done in the sector of engineering. You heard Peter mention that in other male-dominated sectors, there have been extensive research. All other first world countries have done cultural research in STEM and engineering. SWE has led the first national study of its kind to get at the core question for female attrition. What is it about corporate culture that might be repelling women? We got to this question through discussion with the 85 corporate sponsors of SWE, who report that their hiring managers, their talent leaders, are securing their hiring goals for women. But 5 to 8 years later, women are leaving, particularly women targeted as high potentials, women in the leadership pipeline. Clearly, this is an important problem. If we don't have female leadership in engineering, then we can't foster the kinds of contributions that we know quantifiably, and that I'll be getting to in a minute, the difference that women make. Thank you. So, before we did this culture study, we already knew a whole lot about women in engineering and women in STEM. We knew about the dearth of role models. We knew about gendered career paths. We knew about inadequate access to coaches and influential sponsors. And we already know about the chronic, subtle, but acute tension women face, particularly in male-dominated environments, that stem from the classic double bind of stereotyping. The choice that women face every day that they can be considered either likable or competent. We wanted to see what was it that was actually showing up in corporate culture with a gender lens, meaning do men and women experience the day-to-day culture differently? And if they do, what might those differences be? We are delighted to share with you today 4 new insights. Insights we believe help explain female attrition in engineering, and help to inform actionable strategies to work towards solutions. Our culture study engaged 4 of SWE's corporate sponsors. They include Booz Allen Hamilton, 3M, United Technologies, and Honeywell Aerospace. Through their engagement, we were able to get feedback from 3,200 male and female engineering professionals who answered 3 core questions for us. What are your core personal values, the beliefs and behaviors you hold dear? What are the values, the behaviors you experience every single day in your corporate environment? And what are the values you would like to experience in order to bring your best to work? From a very general platform, and believe me, I'm quite challenged to keep my words to 10 minutes here, for detail on what we discovered, this handout was available to you in the back. Some of you have picked it up. Some of you have this, okay? So you have detail available to you in this handout. I will share with you that overall, we found out that male and female engineering professionals hold the same personal values. They are having about the same corporate experience, and they have the same desired values. And as a matter of fact, neither gender is very happy with the engineering workplace, with the total with the total amount of limiting or negative factors reported at 21% for male leaders, for example, and 24% for female leaders. I often think about a shark, or I use a shark analogy when talking about culture, because culture is always moving. There is no such thing as status quo when stewarding organizational culture. Culture is either evolving or it's eroding, and it will be responsive to the loudest voices. If senior leadership, and I am talking about the C-suite, does not actively, intentionally steward the culture will represent other values than those espoused in all of our nice collateral and the plaques on the walls. These are the limiting or negative values reported by both men and women in the engineering workplace. While women report a slightly higher level of dissatisfaction with these same values, again, they are shared across the gender, and they basically fall into 2 categories. One is an exaggerated focus on control. When you see bureaucracy and hierarchy reported as top-tier current cultural behaviors and values, you also see, as we did, for desired values, more autonomy, more freedom, more empowerment, more decision-making authority. The other theme we see is the exaggerated focus on cost reduction, seriously impeding particularly women's core value on quality and excellence. I'm dying to tell you the plane ticket story here, but I'm worried about my time, so if we have time for that, I'll tell you that later. Let's move on. So we know we have shared values, we have shared current corporate experiences, and we have basically the same limits, constraints in the current culture, but we don't have the same attrition rates. Women are leaving. What is it about the female gender that is creating a higher attrition rate? We unpacked particularly the data around female leaders ages 31 to 50, who we considered our target population, knowing that the attrition rate is particularly high for women identified as potential leaders. We wondered if that data set was different than their fellow female colleagues or from their male colleagues? And the answer was yes. The female leader data in that age group was different. The painful truth is that they are the only group who reported 4 key personal and desired values missing from their current culture: accountability, quality, empowerment, and coaching. Particularly important is accountability, a lack of accountability of senior leaders, a lack of the demonstration that senior leaders are doing what they say is important. Accountability is held as a core value for women and for women leaders. Accountability was female leaders 31 to 50, number 1 out of a 10 ranking, number 1 desired value, and missing from the current culture. Why do women feel so strongly about accountability? Women do not have a lot of tolerance for values stretch. They come to work with a set of core values. If they don't see their core values being played out in their corporate experience, they can only tolerate that for so long. And as you've already heard from my fellow panelists, women come to work already stretched in many ways. There is an imbalance of family responsibility. They tackle, just like the men do, the 24/7 workplace realities. They also manage that ongoing tension in the context of the double bind, the implicit balance of being a woman in a male-dominated sector. Why else is accountability so important for women? Women see differently than men. Women are not the same as men. Women take in the bigger picture, the broader context. In fact, we'll talk in a minute about how women's sense of the broader context is contributing value even in the bottom line of corporate organizational growth. Women do their work with their eyes up, and when they see chronic problems not being addressed by senior leaders, they lose confidence in senior leaders, and they see a no-win situation that they opt out of. McKinsey recently came out with their 2016 study of women in the workplace. This is a global study, 34,000 data points. This is not new information. The actual quantifiable difference female leadership makes. Females do not lead in the same way males do. Women bring a different set of leadership and strategic skills, contributing significantly to organizational growth and success, to the extent that investment advisors look at the number of female directors sitting on boards and rate investment in that company differently if there is an adequate number of female leaders. However, while we know that the data is different for women, we know women respond differently and that women contribute different things. Diversity and inclusion is missing. Diversity and inclusion is held as an espoused or stated value across the 4 companies we worked with. Diversity and inclusion for the 3,200 male and female engineers did not surface as a personal value, it did not surface as a current corporate value, and it did not surface as a desired value. Gender is no longer considered part of the diversity and inclusion agenda, and this is a significant issue. Gender intelligence would help us better understand how we think, decide, make decisions differently, how we feel differently, and how we respond differently. The new dynamic for the very subtle structures, systems, and processes that inadvertently advantage men is called second-generation bias. We don't have time to get into it today. I want to take this opportunity to strongly encourage you to read and understand second-generation bias, which is just a fancy way of saying not your mother's sexism. This is sexism that is subtle. It's basically under the table and continues to affect women. Women will continue to leave engineering and other male-dominated sectors until senior leaders take gender intelligence, diversity, and inclusion seriously. We know a lot about why women are leaving, and we know a lot about what can be done. We have fantastic case studies of engineering companies and other companies who have done fantastic work in regard to gender and diversity and inclusion. What we don't know how to do is inspire the C-suite to take this seriously. As affirmed in McKinsey's global study, accountability is a serious problem. Most of our corporations do hold diversity and inclusion strategic goals, but without accountability, without execution, and without follow-up. Until that gap is closed, until senior leaders take accountability for their leadership, the message from female leaders is, we need you to decide what you really want. We want you to mean what you say. We want you to take down the obstacles that are in your control. And let us please do the job we came here to do. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce SWE's Manager of Research, Roberta Rincon, who will be speaking to us about the engineering workplace, the workplace reentry task force, and other research that SWE is currently engaged in.
Thank you, Beth. Next, we would like to share with you the findings from our most recent study entitled Climate Control, Gender and Racial Bias in Engineering. SWE partnered with the Center for Work-Life Law at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law to study engineers' workplace experiences. Joan Williams is well known for her work in gender inequality in the workplace and how gender roles and expectations can influence career success. Along with her colleague Sue Lee, we issued a survey instrument to male and female engineers and engineering technicians. We received more than 3,000 responses, and almost 1/3 of those left comments. 11 interviews were also conducted with female engineers to provide context to the quantitative responses from the survey. The Likert Scale survey asked whether they had faced the basic patterns of implicit bias that have been documented over and over again in social psychology studies. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that can influence our actions and decisions in unconscious ways. These unconscious attitudes can impact decisions around such things as hiring, promotion, performance evaluations, and compensation. This study looked at 4 different types of implicit bias. There was strong evidence of 3 types of bias in the engineering workplace, which I will cover in this presentation. The 4th, tug of war, which looks at conflicts among women, was not as prevalent among the survey respondents. Prove it again bias is when you have to work twice as hard to be considered competent, to have your ideas respected, and when you're basically being held to a higher standard than others, and in some cases being mistaken for administrative or custodial staff. We presented 6 Likert scale statements under this bias type in our survey. This table shows 3 of those statements, highlighting the differences in responses. The table lists the percentage of respondents who agreed with the statements. You can see clear differences, statistically significant differences, between how female engineers and engineers of color responded versus male engineers, white male engineers. For example, the second statement goes to the core of the bias, having to repeatedly prove themselves to get the same level of respect and recognition as their colleagues. 35% of white male engineers agreed with this statement versus 61% of female engineers and 68% of engineers of color. On being mistaken for administrative or custodial staff, less than 10% of male white engineers have experienced this versus almost half of female engineers and engineers of color, highlighting the existence of the view of engineers as the stereotypical white male. Tightrope bias, also known as the double bind that Beth discussed, is when a narrower range of behavior is accepted in women than men. A woman is expected to be nice and friendly and kind, but the traits of decisiveness and toughness, typically associated as masculine traits, are what we appreciate in our leaders. The former is to be seen as nice but weak. When a woman exhibits the latter, she's seen as competent but unlikable. We presented 10 Likert scale statements under this bias type and found stark differences in the responses between white men versus females and engineers of color. The office housework statement is an interesting one. About 1 out of 4 white male engineers stated that they have experienced this bias, which includes such things as being expected to plan office parties, get the coffee, take notes during a meeting. However, almost half of female engineers and engineers of color indicated they have experienced this. But I want to draw your attention to the last statement. I have the same access to desirable assignments as my colleagues. 85% of white male engineers agreed with this statement versus 65% of female engineers and 55% of engineers of color. Less access to desirable assignments and high-profile projects can have a negative impact on a person's career trajectory, impacting their competitiveness when it comes to promotions and accessing senior leadership roles. Maternal wall bias is associated with the belief that women with children are assumed to be less competent and less committed to their work. We presented 6 Likert scale statements related to this bias type in our survey and found that mothers were much more likely than white men with children to report bias triggered by parenthood. 55% of female engineers with children versus 78% of white male engineers with children reported that having children did not change their colleagues' perceptions of their work commitment or competence. In some cases, requesting family leave or a reduced schedule can trigger maternal wall bias. About half of female engineers agreed that asking for family leave or a flexible working arrangement would not hurt their careers versus 63% of white male respondents. One of the quotes shown here highlights the impact that having children can have on a woman's career. One female engineer that responded to the survey stated, "When I was pregnant, my boss really didn't know how to handle planning for my absence. He took a team leader role away from me when I was about 20 weeks pregnant, just in case I had to be out before my due date." These kinds of managerial decisions can negatively impact a woman's career trajectory, making it that much more difficult for them to reach the higher echelons of the profession. The survey also asked whether engineers believed that they had been fairly treated at work with respect to various workplace processes. Both female engineers and engineers of color reported feeling disadvantaged by virtually every workplace process we questioned, particularly in compensation, promotions, performance evaluations, and networking and mentoring opportunities. Female engineers also indicated that they believe it is harder to get hired as a woman. Each year, many studies on women in STEM are published, and we would like to use this research to understand the causes of the gender gap in engineering and technology. Recently, we launched a website to serve as the go-to resource for this information, and you can access that as well as the report on implicit bias at research.swe.org. The website features studies and statistics on women in engineering and other STEM fields. The information is organized into 5 categories: K through 12, higher education, workplace, global, and SWE research and contacts. SWE studies can be found in the SWE research and contacts category, the yellow box that's up there. Providing data to inform decisions that affect women in school and the workplace is an important part of SWE's work, and we will continue to update and populate the information on this site, as well as share our research here as well. Now I'd like to share with you one of the programs that SWE has developed to help technical women get back into the workforce after taking a career break. The STEM Reentry Task Force is a partnership between SWE and iRelaunch, a career reentry company. The task force began with 7 members from SWE's Corporate Partnership Council listed here. The STEM Reentry Task Force supports women who are returning from a career break by providing insight and support, as well as opportunities to explore career possibilities through internships in the STEM industry. Reentry internships give the employer the opportunity to connect with high-caliber returning professionals at a moment when their childcare, elder care, or other responsibilities are reduced or over, and they're ready to re-engage in the workforce. The program also enables employers to increase the number of mid to senior level women in their ranks. The re-entry programs that were launched in the spring were extremely successful, with interns converting to long-term hires ranging from 50 to 100% in some cases. Based on the success of these pilots, IBM and GM have decided to run additional programs in the fall and expand in 2017. And there are additional companies that are planning to launch programs in 2017 as well. You can find out more about this program at the reentry site, reentry.swe.org. There's also a panel discussion that will be happening after this session downstairs in room 112, where you can hear from those that have participated in the program, hear their success stories. Regarding future research, SWE has many areas of interest that we are exploring. We're currently collaborating with the National Society of Black Engineers on a study about minority women in the early stages of their engineering careers, aimed at understanding their experiences in transitioning from college into the workforce and the successes and setbacks that they have experienced. We're also looking at opportunities to add to the research in the K-12 sector, particularly around understanding how interest in STEM is fostered among girls and how they develop their engineering identities. And we are aware of the lack of research that is available on women's experiences and success when they begin their engineering education at a community college. We're interested in gaining a better understanding of the students that start their educational journeys at the community college, and we plan to explore opportunities to engage in research on this topic. Now I would like to welcome Anne Parasek to the podium. Anne is Director of Publications at SWE, and she is going to share a bit more about a special issue of SWE magazine that we're going to be sending out in March.
Yeah, thank you very much. SWE's commitment to authoritative information on women in engineering extends back to the earliest days of the society. In May 1950, SWE was founded, and within 1 year had published the first issue of its journal, which is the predecessor to today's SWE magazine. Significantly, at the same time, SWE began gathering data from the surveys they had taken of prospective members and from the information contained in membership applications. This created a repository of information on women engineers. Obviously, no one else was doing this. In 1954, the Women's Bureau Bulletin that was published by the U.S. Department of Labor was compiled based on SWE statistics. Assessing the status of women engineers, the Society's third president at that time, Catherine Stinson, said, quote, "Women themselves will continue for some time to come to carry the major responsibility for development of equal opportunity in engineering," end of quote. And how true her statement has proven to be. As a side note, Stinson was the very first woman engineer hired by the FAA, and she was instrumental in the early days of that agency. She's shown here in what was obviously a photo op. She is in the lighter colored top in the back. And of course, all people wear high heels and pearls when they work with airplanes. So, SWE Statistics Committee continued to gather data over the years and published a profile of the woman engineer on an irregular basis between 1963 and 1982. Research picked up again in 1993 when SWE partnered with the American Association of Engineering Societies to release a national survey of women and men engineers, a study of the members of 22 engineering societies. This was followed up in 2006 with another study, and that was conducted through Harris Interactive. And we have been publishing the SWE Annual Literature Review for more than 15 years now, providing insight, analysis, and information on the previous year's social science literature regarding women in engineering. There is no other compilation like this, and many find this information to be quite valuable. It's available at SWE.org. And due to the interest in having access to this type of information, coming this spring, we will release a special issue of SWE magazine that will be devoted entirely to research. And it will be presented in a manner that is accessible to non-academics, to non-social scientists. And it will include the annual literature review, SWE's research results, insights from noted researchers. And this will be in addition to our regular spring issue, and it will be available in a digital format with a print-on-demand option. We're very excited about this. So please stay tuned through SWE's social media as the issue release will be announced in March. And now to close this presentation of the State of Women in Engineering, please welcome Karen Hording, CEO and Executive Director of SWE.
I think my test for the day was just maneuvering on the dais there. Before I close it out, I'd like to ask our panelists to stay in place. We do have some time allotted for questions. So I'd like to see anyone who has a question for one of our panelists to just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic over to you. Yes. Sure, the copy of the slides, I think we can have that posted on the app, correct? Yes.
Was there anything that you guys found in your research that was specifically surprising that you didn't expect to see?
In the culture study, frankly, we were surprised that there wasn't a bigger difference in the level of dissatisfaction between men and women. When you consider female attrition rates, we thought we were going to see a much bigger distinction between the genders. So it was a surprise that they were closer than they were. The other surprise, to be honest, was not about accountability generally, but that accountability surfaced as female leaders' #1 desired value. That was very interesting to us. I would also say on the issue of balance, of life balance, family work balance, we saw a clear indication that corporate focus on flex schedules and strategies around balance are getting traction. In fact, all of the female subgroups named balance in their current culture, which frankly was surprising. The one female subgroup that did not name balance was female leaders, 31 to 50.
Joan Williams is who we partnered with to do the implicit bias study. And she's conducted this same study in other professions, including law. And it was my first time working with the survey instrument, but she's seen the results and responses from other professions. So what seemed to surprise her was the number of comments that were left by men and women, predominantly women, on our survey who were interested in sharing their experiences. She was basically overwhelmed by the amount of qualitative analysis that needed to be done. But in addition to that, there were also respondents from both men and women who indicated that engineering is really more of a meritocracy, that they almost denied the existence of bias in the workplace in a way, that you are rewarded for the work that you do. So that was interesting and a bit surprising.
I'd like to just add a note at the very beginning of our study. We were surprised, frankly, to find out that the other first world nations, other continents and countries, are looking at culture very seriously as a strategy for boosting engagement, organizational growth, and success. The United States is really lagging behind in better understanding culture as a driver of engagement.
In some of the work that we've been doing, we've been looking at differences in how policies are applied in practice. And something that's been interesting to find is that a lot of policies that are put in place that are meant to support things like work-life integration, flexible family arrangement, leave, things like that. A lot of times if those aren't put in place within a cultural environment that actively supports that from the leadership, then you can see the opposite of the intended effect. And one place that we've seen this, for example, in academic environments, is around parental leave. And in some of the institutions, when they're trying to make do without actually putting in a specific parental leave, you'll have temporary alternative duty assignment, or you will have something like you can sign up for disability policy if you are getting ready to have a child. And the temporary alternative duty assignment is meant to give you some flexibility in stopping the tenure clock, for example, so that when you're taking leave from the workplace for family reasons, it's not counted against you in your evaluation. And we found that often in these environments where there's a stigma attached to making use of that policy, that men will take advantage of it at a higher rate than women will because of fear of that stigma. And at the same time, when they're making use of that policy, they'll use it not necessarily for the intended reasons, but to get a boost on their productivity. So to finish submitting a grant application, or to put in for research, or something like that, and then the evaluation bar gets raised even higher. So it's this really complicated space where the culture that the policy is in makes a huge difference. And so I think that you're right in terms of needing to really look at these cultural effects that are taking place in the workplace.
Just sort of a different issue here. I mean, I was involved in some research a couple of years ago on a national survey, from a national data set, which looked at volatility in STEM employment. And one of the things I didn't know, and I was surprised to learn, is how much volatility there is in STEM employment. Enormous amount of turnover in the labor force, lots of layoffs, in part because of military spending, in part because of the dot-com boom bust kinds of cycle, things of that sort. And what this produces is not so much unemployment, but sort of lots of exits and re-entries to the labor force, which makes your research all the more important. And what we found in that particular piece of research is that there's lots of people who leave the labor force, and it's really relatively easy to find another job in STEM relative to other fields, but that women respond to the loss of employment in STEM differently than men. We found that married women with children were much more likely to leave the labor force altogether, having been laid off or lost a job through this kind of displacement, and that when the women who did return, especially among single women or women who did not have children, they were much more likely than men to return to a non-STEM field. So I think maybe that was sort of a surprising thing for me, you know, just to think about how the structure of the labor market and its functioning in STEM may be feeding into this kind of pattern of non-retention that we're all trying to puzzle out.
I'm curious a little bit more about government's role in all this, and if there are ways that the government might be able to help advance the ball in terms of increasing the number of women and minorities in STEM, in terms of policies, programs, initiatives, things like that.
So the government had a big impact on women's participation in STEM with the Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which resulted in opening a variety of educational institutions, universities to women. There have been a variety of efforts over the decades, really by the National Science Foundation, to broaden the participation of women and minorities in STEM careers, and those efforts are ongoing. But we haven't seen the kind of results that we would like to see from those initiatives, as the data that I showed at the beginning of the presentation indicate. One of the more recent efforts of the National Science Foundation is the ADVANCE program, which is focused on changing the culture of universities to help women faculty be more successful, with the underlying goal that increasing women faculty will also increase the enrollment and graduation of more women students and entry into the workforce.
In studying where female leadership is most successful, particularly at the highest echelons, the Northern European countries are leading the way. If you look at Denmark, Finland, Sweden, those countries, those governments have mandated, passed laws about the ratio of female directorships. The dilemma that we're talking about is a top-down situation. Are we going to see the US government pass mandates of this nature? I really don't think so. I think that's not going to happen. What we're shooting for is a deeper understanding at the board level and in the C-suites that what we are talking about belong to them. It is their leadership charter. This issue of women in the workplace, women of color, female leadership does not belong to talent acquisition. This does not belong to HR. This does not belong to diversity and inclusion leaders. In fact, the saddest question I was asked when I debriefed SWE's culture results in front of the corporate sponsors of SWE, we are talking about the senior leaders in these organizations trying to forward exactly the goals and strategies, A, that the C-suite says are important, and that B, make up their job function. The question was asked, what can we do to better sell the value of diversity and inclusion to senior leadership? This is a very sad question. Diversity and inclusion as a corporate function is over 25 years old, and yet Senior leaders in those seats are having to sell the value of the function. It speaks volumes. And frankly, that is why I posited our challenge the way I did. We have the facts. We know what the need is. What we don't know is how to inspire the boards and the C-suite to do what they say they want to do in regard to these goals.
I have a question about the double bind concept that you report, where women report having to choose between being perceived as likable versus competent. And I will say personally, as I advance in my career, it's less and less of an issue, because I don't know if because I'm more confident or I just don't care. But my question is, have you surveyed men, and is that perception real? Do men perceive strong, competent women as not likable, or is it just something, you know, women worry about because of confidence?
It's actually both men and women evaluate other women in that way. There's a lot of research that shows that it's something that becomes internalized by women, and then they evaluate other women in those ways, because you see that treatment time and time again from a pretty young age and internalize it. So it's both men and women that evaluate women in that double bind way.
If they're competent and strong, they're viewed as unlikable?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll just add to that to say that very specific research has been done in the study of performance evaluations. Are different words used for men and for women? Hands down, the word aggressive only shows up in female evaluations. And my favorite quote, with tears in my eyes, I share this, is, she should, quote, trim her sharp elbows, unquote, just as an example.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that in terms of the language that's used to describe women's behavior. And the work done at the Center for American Women in Politics, which is at Rutgers, they have been following election cycles extensively. And not just at the presidential level, but also what happens, you know, down ticket, what happens to women when they run to office, for office. And I think if there was ever an example of the double bind, this is certainly where we see it. But if you're interested in pursuing it, they have a lot of information on their website specifically about gender, language, and politics.
So,
The Center for American Women in Politics, and it's out of Rutgers.
So I had a quick point of clarity and then a question. So the point of clarity was on the STEM reentry task force, and those companies offer jobs for either gender. It's not just for women. So just so everything's being done fair there. My question is on the one takeaway that you have in the handout. It says men and women report the same values in day-to-day experiences. The difference is how women respond, they leave. Do you know, how do the men respond, or why? Obviously the men don't leave, but do you know why they don't leave? What was the point there?
Well, from the culture study, we believe that women are leaving on those 4 insights that I covered. They are leaving because they have a more pointed and acute reaction to the lack of accountability. Women surfaced accountability as their #1 desired value. It was only women who reported accountability as missing from their current workplace, and accountability is a closely held personal value. So that's one example. Value stretch was another reason. So basically the insights that were shared in today's presentation go to why women are more frequently making decisions to leave than men are. How do men what? We didn't ask them, but I will say from the research overall regarding gender differences, and we know this by now, men tend to respond by putting their eyes down and working on what's in front of them. So they don't like it, but they're going to put their eyes down and they're going to get to it. Women are also going to get to it, but they've got their eyes up and they're taking in the context and they are saying, wait a minute, this could be different.
I think we have time for one more question, so we'll go up to the front there.
Actually, my question was on the accountability, on the definition of it, because you used it a lot, and my experience on accountability is that it's fairness. If that's is that a fair synonym for what you're saying? One, and two, if it is fairness, and you're saying women have their head up, what is the percentage of the fairness that they're observing that's related to diversity issues? Meaning, in a workplace, a woman may uniquely go through certain obstacles or observe certain obstacles that are not visible to a man, like sexual harassment, for example. So if you're observing non-accountability on something related to fairness, even if it's not you, and you could in the future be involved in that, I mean, how much of that did you all attribute to this accountability question?
Thank you. So I'm going to answer in reverse order. The actual words in our survey, both the positive and the negative words, were customized by the Corporate Partnership Council. That was a very interesting exercise. And these corporate sponsors added words like hostility, bullying, discrimination, disrespect, and bias. So when I answered an earlier question about what was surprising, not only did we expect to see a bigger differential between how men were feeling about their workplace and how women were feeling about the workplace, we were bracing ourselves to see some of those words in the descriptors. They weren't. The top words that I showed on the slide, I'm not saying nobody picked them, but they were not the majority view, if you will, out of the 3,200, both male and female. When we looked at the female data, those words were not used. I also want to share the core of your question, which I so appreciate, goes to the second generation bias component, because think about the fact that diversity and inclusion wasn't even selected as a core value or as a desired value. We have a workplace, and we know this also from research with our millennials, that seriously believe sexism was their mother's problem or their grandmother's problem, but it certainly doesn't apply to them. And frankly, we think the reason the attrition rate kicks in at 5 to 8 years is because the light starts to dawn that things aren't quite as fair here as I had hoped. Now, to your first question about the definition of accountability, we don't really think of it as fairness. We think of it as keeping your agreements. Now, ultimately, you can look at that as fair or not fair, but we are going for, are we being responsible for our words? If we say quality is important, then we are going to equip you with what you need to do a quality job. What women are finding, and men are too, it's just a little more acute for women, is that they are there to do quality work. They totally sign up for the quality value, but they are working in conditions that almost prohibit a quality output because of the exaggerated focus on cost reduction, as an example. So we target with accountability really the walking, I hate to use the cliche, but the walking the talk. You make an agreement with me, I expect you to follow through on that agreement, or at least communicate with me about it. That's what we mean by accountability or responsibility.
So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending today to learn more about the state of women in engineering. The research discussed today allows us to better understand what's causing the gender gap in STEM In addition, it's allowing us to identify initiatives to empower more women to pursue STEM and reach their fullest potential. Through our own internal research and due diligence as a society, we aim to remain an invaluable resource to the industry in order to be a catalyst for change. So thank you very much.